At a massive military training facility deep in the desert in Inner Mongolia, Chinese troops from the People's Liberation Army take part in a mock battle. A battle for Taiwan. It's 2015 and China has built some familiar looking buildings on a practice battlefield on the Zhuhai base, and some have a striking resemblance to those in Taiwan, like this one, which looks very similar to this one, Taiwan's presidential office. Both buildings have a rectangular layout divided in the middle. Both are 5 stories high with a 6th floor on each of the corners. They even have a central tower in the same place. This appears to be a replica city, complete with highway interchanges and even an airport. It's now obscured from Google Earth. In 2017, Chinese President Xi Jinping inspected his troops at an impressive military parade there. Like every leader since Chairman Mao, he's vowed to absorb Taiwan. Troops on this base prepare for future wars. Fast forward to the present, and this is all starting to look a bit too real. There's a big question about Taiwan's future and how long it can consider itself a sovereign nation. So how is it there's all this confusion about Taiwan's sovereignty? In 1949, the communists seized power in mainland China, and the Nationalist Army and its supporters fled to the island of Taiwan, a province of China. It was the end of a brutal civil war. The government in Taiwan, backed by the United States, formed what it called the Republic of China, the ROC. The Communist Party, backed by the Soviet Union, established the People's Republic of China, the PRC. In 1971, Taiwan walked out of the United Nations after a resolution to recognize China as the sole government. Taiwan would not accept dual representation, having both the PRC and the ROC at the table. 2 years later, at the height of the Cold War, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam visited China and became one of the first Western leaders to recognise the communist government as the legitimate ruler. America quickly followed, and those still on Taiwan's side were suddenly on the fringe. Taiwan ended 38 years of martial law in the late 1980s and planned its first democratic elections in 1996. In the days and weeks leading up to the vote, China fired missiles into the Taiwan Strait as part of live military exercises. The US marshalled its forces and sent in what was the biggest display of American military might since the Vietnam War. China backed down. Beijing's worries grew as Taiwan's increasingly democratic leaders forged a national and economic identity distinct and separate from the mainland. China passed an anti-secession law which would trigger military action if Taiwan declared independence. At the dawn of the 21st century, Taiwan is emerging as a democratic success story. The population is highly educated. It's become the world's biggest computer chip manufacturer, and it has a GDP greater than that of Sweden or the Netherlands. Prosperity fed nationalism, and it didn't take long before 88% of the population openly supported a democracy. In 2020, President Tsai Ing-wen won a second term in a landslide. It was widely seen as a snub to Beijing. Taiwan has always rejected China's one country, two systems policy. Beijing offered to allow Taiwan to keep its own government and military and its way of life in return for acknowledging that it was part of China. In Hong Kong, the same one country, two systems policy is effectively over. After months of unprecedented protests in 2019, Beijing imposed the National Security Law, quashing dissent and following the principle that only those deemed patriots would be allowed to govern the city.
If you look at the way in which China has very slowly managed to turn Hong Kong into another province of China, it can't use the same method for Taiwan. Taiwan is an independent nation with its own judiciary and its own military. It simply cannot exercise the same kind of power. So instead, what can China do to try to get Taiwan back? It can use economic coercion, it can use military threats, and it can try to convince the rest of the world that Taiwan's fate is inevitable, and so there is no point in trying to defend it.
China is still repeating its long-held view that reunification is a historical inevitability. When they talk about reunification, you have to remember the Communist Party has never ruled Taiwan. Analysts say that conquering the island of 23 million people is a mission that's now China's top military priority. On the streets of Taipei, a display of military might draws a huge crowd for what the Taiwanese mark as their national day. President Tsai Ing-wen speaks directly to the people, saying her country will not bow to China.
因为中国所设定的路径里头，不会有台湾的自由民主的生活方式，更不会有2300万人的主权。
President Xi sees Taiwan as a breakaway province, saying again and again Taiwan must be and will be reunified with China. That threat means the risk of war is higher than it's been in decades. Having crushed the resistance to its rule in Hong Kong, China is increasingly targeting Taiwan.
勇者无畏，未来请你来。
Slick recruitment videos put the call out to young men, encouraging them to join the Air Force. China's warplanes are flying close to Taiwan almost daily. The Taiwanese president says these military threats are making the situation more complex and fluid than at any other point in the past 72 years. Taiwan claims Chinese jets are crossing what it calls the median line, an imaginary border in the Taiwan Strait. China says that line doesn't exist. Before 2020, Chinese aircraft crossed this median line only once, in 2019, but never in the 20 years before. This year, things started to change. In a single day in January, 15 jets crossed into Taiwan's air defence identification zone, the buffer outside its airspace. And that has continued. By April, there was a record of 25 a day. By the beginning of October, 154 aircraft from China's Air Force flew into Taiwan's defence zone in just 4 days.
A year ago, they were sending a lot more surveillance aircraft. Now we can see that they're sending bombers. This is the PLA testing its own capability, but also demonstrating that it still has red lines when it comes to Taiwan, and it wants the United States, Taipei, Australia, and everyone else in the region to know that.
Meanwhile, Taiwan has also spent billions of dollars defending its airspace. As these confrontations intensify, the balance of power is shifting, and it's pushing the impasse that's continued for decades into a dangerous new phase. Many analysts don't believe a war is imminent because the economic and diplomatic aftershocks could be staggering for China. But some fear a major conflict is inevitable.
The most significant flashpoint now that could lead to a large-scale war is Taiwan.
This problem is much closer to us than most think, and we have to take this on, put those deterrence capabilities in place in the near term and with urgency.
The idea of an invasion of Taiwan being inevitable actually does the Communist Party's work for it. It makes the threat seem so big and so scary that we have no choice but to give in now. When we talk about this inevitable conflict, we undermine 70 years of deterrence that has kept Taiwan free.
But China is acting with more and more confidence. It's believed President Xi holds the view that American power has diminished and that the US no longer has the will to send its forces to fight another war if one were to break out in Taiwan. And regardless of who steps in to help Taiwan, many believe the People's Liberation Army will win. China has more than 2 million active duty troops. It's the world's biggest military, nearly twice the size of the US military. Taiwan, on the other hand, has fewer than 300,000 soldiers, but its military is in crisis, and there are real concerns it doesn't have the ability to defend itself. So, Taiwan has committed to boosting its defence budget to $20 billion in 2022. China has also been ramping up its military spending from $28 billion in 1990 to $340 billion in 2020. Although this is dwarfed by the $1 trillion spent by the US in that same year.
The defense of Taiwan is in our own hands, and we are absolutely committed to that. And if China is going to launch a war against Taiwan, we will fight to the end.
Taiwan would look to the West to step in and help.
The Australian government is always one of those who will stand up for Taiwan.
Australia trades with Taiwan, engages in cultural and educational exchanges, but it doesn't recognise Taiwan as a sovereign state.
What we've seen in the past is a real reluctance on Australia's part to engage with what it sees as the Taiwan problem. They barely talk about it, it's considered sensitive from Beijing's perspective. But as the relationship between Australia and China has deteriorated, and as China has increasingly shown its muscle when looking at Taiwan, Australia is starting to change its tune.
Taiwan has diplomatic relations with only 15 countries, like Guatemala, Haiti, Nauru, and the Vatican. All other countries have broken official ties with Taipei and accepted a one China policy, the idea that there's only one Chinese government, which doesn't recognise Taiwan as its own country. The US has officially endorsed the one China position since the 1970s. However, America enjoys an unofficial relationship with Taiwan. It remains Taiwan's staunchest informal ally. It sells billions of dollars worth of advanced weaponry to Taiwan.
The United States has a policy that it describes as strategic ambiguity, where it has not actually said whether it would or would not go to Taiwan's defense in the event of an invasion. But that has not stopped the United States from continuing to show symbolic and political support for Taiwan and selling very large arms packages to Taiwan.
It's reported that a US Special Operations Unit has been secretly training Taiwanese forces since 2020. Drawings depicting an imagined invasion of Taiwan were splashed across Chinese media after those record-breaking warplane incursions in October. This one depicts the attack in the skies and on the streets of Taiwan, calling it re-unification by the People's Liberation Army. Another by the same cartoonist shows an amphibious attack, captioned as the landing operation. And remember this? This illustrates a hypothetical attack on Taiwan's presidential palace. It's captioned, "The Destruction." The government-owned Global Times wrote that many web users commented saying they hoped this would come true as soon as possible. 2022 will be a decisive year for China. In February, it hosts the Winter Olympics in Beijing, almost guaranteeing it will not risk a simultaneous diplomatic or military row. In October, the Communist Party will hold its 20th Congress, where Xi Jinping's presidency will likely be renewed for a record third term. That potentially sets up a future showdown with the next presidents of both Taiwan and the United States. So while China says it's committed to a peaceful reunification with Taiwan, it's also never ruled out taking it by force.